What caused the Civil War? While Ms. Nikki Haley was reluctant to say the S word, we all know that slavery caused a civil war. But the question that goes to the heart of race and racism in America is this: was slavery the Civil War's immediate cause or its underlying cause?
The people on the far left, there's no need to overstate the case. Slavery was the huge issue between these sectors, and nobody is or nobody should be disputing that. And on the other hand, I think Nikki Haley, presumably because she's in a political primary and didn't want to offend maybe who she perceives as to be Republican voters, refused to say the S word when she said, what causes slavery. It was ridiculous.
The S word.
It's just ridiculous. And, I hope we haven't gotten to the point where we can't discuss history in political campaigns, but although the Republicans had promised up and down they were not going to attack slavery in the states where it existed, they were only going to restrict slavery from going into new states. They offer them guarantees, even a constitutional amendment to promise to never interfere with slavery. They would never have voted for government to go to war for the purpose of freeing the slaves. They would never have gone to war for freeing the slaves. Lincoln was very clever in a sense. He took warships down. Even his cabinet was against, by the way, going to war. In these states, they're not declaring war. They don't want a war. They would, when the war started, and I have many accounts of this in my book, that they were shocked. As one of them said, war was not part of the plan. They just wanted to be separate. They would have slavery. They would have, their institutions, their culture based around slavery. But Lincoln's still very careful. Twice during this period, generals announced wholesale emancipations in their territory. Lincoln retracts it. That's my bailiwick. Only I have the right. He says all knew that he talks about the slavery interest. This was somehow the cause of the war. So somehow, not that it was the one cause, the only cause, the thing that brought them to war. It was somehow behind it. He's careful to respect the nuances of history. Then he says that he envisions the war as being the punishment that God meted out to North and South for the crime of slavery, for the 250 years of the bondman's toil. He says, and if God wills it, it will go on till every cent that had been earned through the slave trade and the owning of slaves was frittered away.
Did you know that the South actually contemplated emancipating its enslaved population? Had that happened, do you think that Northerners would have continued fighting and dying in that bloody war against the Confederacy? Hey there, News Peelers. Today is January 31st, 2024, and this is Adel, your host at the History Behind News podcast. Aren't you tired of the repetitive news on TV and social media? They just go over the same dramatized developments all day long. Do you ever wonder what happened before our news? I mean, how did we get here? They say if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. So while others cover the news, I uncover its history. I call this peeling the history behind news, which we accomplish in weekly conversations with distinguished scholars who delve deep into history to give us their fascinating perspectives from our past. I'm committed to making in-depth history that are researched and written by scholars, enjoyable and accessible to everyone. So grab a cup of coffee or your favorite drink or both, and let's get into it. In Berlin, New Hampshire, a voter asked Ms. Nikki Haley this question: what was the cause of the United States Civil War? She started out by saying, well, don't come with an easy question or anything. As for her answer, this is what she said. I mean, the cause of the Civil War was basically how the government was going to run, the freedoms of what people could and couldn't do. Then she threw the voter's question back at him. What do you think the cause of the Civil War was? The voter responded, "I'm not running for president. I wanted to see your thoughts on the cause of the Civil War." She then continued with some stuff about freedom, rights of the people, capitalism, and the role of government. The voter then said, "Thank you. In the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you can't answer that question without mentioning the word slavery." Then, in response to the voter's follow-up question, she responded, rather plaintively, "What do you want me to say about slavery?" The voter shot back, "No, you've answered my question. Thank you." Ms. Haley forced a smile and then said, "Next question." To her credit, though, the next day she said this on a local New Hampshire radio show. "Of course the Civil War was about slavery, and that's the easy part. Yes, I know it was about slavery. I'm from the South." Ms. Haley was born in South Carolina. She was a U.S. House Representative for South Carolina and was the governor of that state, where the Civil War started with those first shots at Fort Sumter. At the opening, I said in this episode would look into whether slavery was the Civil War's immediate cause or its underlying cause. Well, aside from the fact that this makes for a great conversation about history, what does it really matter? At the end, the war happened. How does the distinction help us now, whether or not slavery was the underlying cause or the immediate cause of the Civil War? As it turns out, this distinction does really matter. It absolutely matters because history is not headline news. We can't and shouldn't dumb it down into a short sentence. And if we do, then we learn nothing from our past, including about our own racial prejudices and the actions they motivated or prevented. So to better understand the conditions that led to the Civil War and how politicians rallied support for its continuation despite its unprecedented carnage, I spoke to Roger Lowenstein. Mr. Lowenstein reported for the Wall Street Journal for more than a decade. He's a historian, and his writings about his books appear in the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Fortune, the New York Times, Atlantic, the Washington Post, and many other publications. He has written several books, including New York Times bestsellers about different important personalities and periods in our country's history. His upcoming book is a biography of Sam Walton. In this conversation, we draw from his book on the Civil War. It's titled Ways and Means, Lincoln and His Cabinet and the Financing of the Civil War, which was the winner of the Harold Holzer Lincoln Forum Book Prize. It's a fantastic book that I read and thoroughly enjoyed. To learn more about Mr. Lowenstein, you can visit his homepage, the link for which is provided in the detailed caption of this episode. So, stay with me as Mr. Lowenstein and I peel the history behind this news. Why did the small European kingdoms, and not the huge empires of the Middle East, conquer the world?
But they also have a problem collecting taxes. In these enormous empires spread over a large area. So the Ottomans, for instance, collect much less in tax revenues than their European enemies, the Austro-Hungarians.
And if Japan could catch up with the West, then why couldn't the countries of the Middle East, with their vast natural resources and young and able populations?
Unlike the clergy in the Ottoman Empire would say, no printing press. The central government and these lords in Japan were divided. And so some of them were really willing to experiment. And they began experimenting. They experimented with different political institutions. They sought advice in the West, and they also sought Western learning. The goal was, let's bring in ideas and technology from the West, but keep the Westerners out. Just keep them under control.
I spoke to Dr. Philip Hoffman about these important topics at Unraveling the Middle East podcast. Dr. Hoffman is a professor of business economics and history at Caltech. He's the author of Why Did Europe Conquer the World?, a book that we discussed. I've dropped a link for you to my conversation with Dr. Hoffman. Now, let's start our conversation with Mr. Lowenstein about what caused America's Civil War. Mr. Lowenstein, it's a pleasure to have you on our program again. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Did slavery cause the Civil War, or was slavery the underlying cause of the Civil War? I'm not trying to get cute with words here. I think there's a difference.
Yeah. Well, Adel, first, it's great to be back on your show. And everyone wants to force this question into an 8-word soundbite. So let me just take a little more. Obviously, slavery was one of the main underlying causes of the war. There had been 10 years, more than 10 years of heated battles in Congress, Kansas-Nebraska Act, 8 Compromise of 1850, many of these battles between North and South over the issue of slavery. So this is brimming, it's simmering, it's heating up. When you get to the actual war itself, the shooting war that started in April of 1861, I think you have to look very carefully.
So this is like almost a month after Lincoln becomes president.
It's a month after Lincoln became president, and it's many years after the North and South have clearly been divided over slavery. I mean, if they just wanted to have a war over slavery, they could have gone to war in 1850 or in 1852 or 1854, because the South was very firm. They were not going to give up slavery. As the Republicans rose in the North, they were very firm. They didn't like it, but they didn't go to war. But something happened. Something happened to get to your question now, to actually cause it. And if we look carefully at how the Civil War started, it really happened in 2 parts. When I say 2 parts,
okay.
If you think just for a second about America getting into World War II, there was one action. There were underlying causes, but Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The next day, FDR's in Congress. A day that will live in infamy. We're at war. One thing, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. It was one step. The Civil War was 2 steps. The first step is the South secedes. And it's not the whole South. It's not even all the cottons, not even all the slave states. It's the 7 what we call cotton states in the Deep South.
Wait. Let me make sure I follow you. You're saying not the entire South seceded. Only 7 states that produce cotton.
Only 7 states produced that were primarily cotton: South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and so on. So Arkansas, 7 of them. That began with South Carolina, Nikki Haley state, of course.
Of course, yeah.
Paying close attention to the news. And South Carolina seceded in December of 1860. This is right after Lincoln was elected. And they seceded really because they were afraid that the incumbent Republicans were a very anti-slavery party. Although the Republicans had promised up and down they were not going to attack slavery in the states where it existed. They were only going to restrict slavery from going into new states, Kansas and the states further west.
So what this means is that we're not going to attack the existence of slavery. We're going to prevent its expansion.
That's right. And the Republicans said that again and again. Lincoln said that again and again. And as the southern cotton states begin to secede, Lincoln and the Republicans reinforce that. They offer them guarantees, even a constitutional amendment to promise to never interfere with slavery, which was not much of an offer because in Lincoln's mind, they didn't have the legal right. And the law was very important to Lincoln. The law is very important to Lincoln. They had the right.
They didn't have the legal right to secede? Is that what you mean?
No. They didn't have the right to tell the states what institutions they could have to abolish slavery.
Yeah.
They had the right in federal territories because they were federal, not to permit slavery there, but they didn't have the right. So they were not wiping out slavery. Meanwhile, the southern states are seceding, and there's no war. South Carolina secedes in December. Buchanan says, in effect, and Horace Greeley, Aryan sisters go in peace. South Carolina is followed by Mississippi, by Louisiana, by the others I mentioned. I think all of those, the other 6, in January. Now, these states, they're not declaring war. They don't want a war. They would, when the war started, and I have many accounts of this in my book, they were shocked. As one of them said, war was not part of the plan. They just wanted to be separate. They would have slavery. they would have, their institutions, their culture based around slavery, but other differences as well, not industrial, more agrarian, many differences, and the North would be up there. Lincoln, however, has taken an oath or takes an oath on March 4th to defend the Constitution. And the Constitution, as he reads it, is protects all the states and protects them in one union. And he believes he's sworn to defend that union. So ultimately, and this is April, this is a month after he takes office, and it's November, December, January, February, March. It's about 4.5 months after the secession start. He sends ships down to Charleston Harbor,
Fort Sumter,
to reinforce a federal fort. And the South, the Confederacy, the now newly named nation of the Confederacy, seeing its territory invaded, fires, and the war starts. So why did the North send those ships? The North really provoked the war. The South did not want war. Lincoln provoked the war for what reason? And he said this again and again. And that reason is because the South has seceded. The South had violated the compact of the states to be one union. And he says repeatedly, and it's in every letter of the time that discusses it. I found a letter where someone's a soon-to-be soldier writes to his mother in Europe saying this war is not being fought over slavery. Now, everybody knows slavery is in the background, because what's the big difference between these two sides that are at war? The big difference is one of them has slave labor and one of them mostly doesn't. Although there are some, we should note, there are 4 slave states who never will secede and will fight, with the Union. But
I'm sorry, you said 4 slave states did not secede and fought along the.
Yeah, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. I mean,
that's right.
And after some skirmishing, it's not clear. Maryland at the beginning is very secessionist. It's very hot, but ultimately these four states remain with the Union. They're slave states. By the way, that's another evidence. There are slave states. What are they fighting for? They're certainly not fighting for emancipation because they're slave states.
Mr. Lowenstein, I want to interrupt you, please, and get some perspective on what Lincoln was thinking, his point of view at that time. We're talking about 1860 and protecting the Union. I'm trying to understand for myself is if the word union was as important then as it is now to us.
Well, it was very important to Lincoln for reasons I'll get to, but it was also very fraught. So why is it very important? Lincoln grows up for a few years in Kentucky, then Indiana, and then Illinois. He makes his business, which of course is law, but he's really a commercial lawyer. He's representing railroads. He's representing people with claims against railroads.
Yeah.
He's very involved. Before that, he clerks for a store, which goes bust, which fails. He has a number of other jobs. He's very involved in the commerce of the country. And, today, if you want to buy something, you go on Amazon and you buy it. But back then, there was no Amazon. There was no one currency. There weren't rivers to get you to big cities if you were in parts of the country like where Lincoln was. And the union of the country, being able to get goods, particularly from the interior of the country, from places like Salem, Illinois, or Springfield, Illinois, to the big cities in the East, that was everything. It meant if you were a farmer that your crops wouldn't spoil on the way to port, and they'd be worth something. That was just, everything. And to have any economic hope. And he always, when he talked about the strength of democracy, it was prosperity. And if the Union couldn't be prosperous, he always felt that would be it would be a failing. The American dream was hinged on its prosperity. And he felt they had to be a union. He gave a speech where he said, together as one country, we're connected to ports to every continent. From the West Coast, we can go to Asia. From the South, we can go to Latin America. From the East, we can go to Europe, of course. But if we separate, no one part of the country can access all of these, much less access each other. And Richard Hofstadter, the famous historian, said something. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially he said to Lincoln, the acid test of a democracy was economic, and he really felt that the Union would rise or fall on being a union. Now, he also realized, growing up in the states that he grew up in, and they were basically not abolitionist states. Kentucky was a slave state. Southern Illinois, where he came from, was had a lot of Kentuckians in it. They fled there. They were very not only anti-abolition. They passed black laws to prevent blacks from settling there, to prevent them from voting there, to prevent them serving on juries. There's no other word to use for Illinois in 1860. It was a very racist place. Lincoln, ran against Stephen Douglas as an anti-slavery candidate in 1858, and of course lost.
Wow. Before we talk about the nature
let me just finish where that point is going. Is Lincoln knew that to take too strong a stand would be a political suicide. That to make a union of this country, even a union of the North, he had to be very careful in
political stance on slavery. You mean
on slavery and on what we now call civil rights?
Yeah,
or equality, social equality for blacks who were free.
When I asked you about union, their perspective of the term of the word union back in the 1850s, coming up to the Civil War, in comparison to ours, you said you wanted to share with me Lincoln's, which you did, view, but you also said the term was fraught. Well, let's talk about that part.
Fraught because the South obviously wanted slavery. In places like Massachusetts, where I live in New England, there were more abolitionists, but there weren't many blacks in New England, so they were almost armchair integrationists.
Yeah.
But in the areas of the country that were very much mixed, which had more blacks living in them, more Southerners drifting up, places like Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, places that remarkably today even we think of as swing states. The country had very different feelings. They would never have voted for government to go to war for the purpose of freeing the slaves. They would never have gone to war for freeing the slaves. Lincoln was very clever in a sense. He took warships down. Even his cabinet was against, by the way, going to war. Even his own cabinet. But he was very clever. He took warships down there, just, he said, to reprovision. And when he was fired on, when the Union ships were fired on, that sort of raised the cry. Now we have to fight back. Honor meant a lot in the 19th century. And in effect, he furnished the excuse to go to war. But there wasn't really a sentiment in the South or in the North to go to war before it happened.
That's fascinating. First of all, you said he was careful to send the ships to Fort Sumter, which I've visited, and I encourage our audience to visit, to reprovision. This is not to go fight a war. We're just sending supplies over there. Basically.
Yes, that's the supplies. The supplies might include arms,
so
that they could food, and they would reprovision the fort to withstand Southern attack. But he was not going to offload troops.
Yeah. So with all
the
of
South,
this,
by the way, the South at that point. Remember, I said only 7 states had seceded. Those 7 did not notably include North Carolina or Virginia. Virginia was a border state.
Yeah.
It was by far and away the most industrial state. If you look at it geographically, it occupies this prime territory between Maryland and Pennsylvania in the north, Pennsylvania to the west and the south. Without Virginia, the South couldn't have lasted, nearly 4 years. And the South felt that to rally these other southern states, Virginia was a slave state, but it wasn't a slave state. It didn't have the proportion of slaves, didn't have the cotton. It was slowly shifting to industries that weren't as dependent on slavery, unlike Mississippi and Alabama, which were all in for cotton and rice, all in for slavery.
Yeah.
So Jefferson Davis and the states that had seceded felt that to get these border states to go in with them, they would have to provoke a war and call on their honor, in quotes, as Southerners and as fellow slaveholders to go in, and that's what they did.
So you're talking about how the South rallied other reluctant Southern states to join the war. And before that, you said several stuff that were fascinating. Many of these states were not abolitionists. They even had black laws, for crying out loud. So from what I hear from you is that Northerners, it doesn't seem like they would go and die to free enslaved blacks.
Illinois had an election in 1862. It was in the summer. It's when Lincoln, their favorite son. When
So we're like about a year into the war.
4 year plus into the war. Lincoln's working on the Emancipation Proclamation. Mm-hmm. Illinois at the time is redoing its own constitution and has it has two referenda. One is whether or not blacks should be able to move in, and the other is whether or not blacks should be able to vote. And the one on whether or not blacks should be able to move in is easily voted down. The one on whether or not they should be able to vote is voted down is rejected 7-1. In fact, wow. a reporter for the New York Times is there, and he writes back and he says, again, I'm paraphrasing, but it's completely accurate in the sense of it. He says, not in any of Jefferson Davis's councils, will you find such a prejudicial, vote or reaction.
And Jefferson Davis being the president of the South. So if that's the case, how did Lincoln rally Northerners to go fight this war?
Well,
does it go back to Union that you were saying?
The mentality is really, the honor really carried a lot of weight. They were fired on. You have to read these accounts. New York State was a completely copperhead, meaning leaning pro-Southern state. All these merchants dominated New York. They didn't want to lose their cotton business, their trade. It's really on the brink of treason. And once Fort Sumter attacks, or Fort Sumter is attacked, by the Confederacy, all of a sudden the brass bands are marching. There are huge crowds. Even the Democratic financiers in New York start coughing up big money to form regiments, because this is what happened that day. It didn't all come from the federal government. The states, often supported by private donors, bought the uniforms, the ammunitions, and so on. And
private donors. Interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
They accepted it from all sources. They raised bonds. The states raised bonds. And New York is all of a sudden gaga for war. It is just, it's sort of the way things were in the 19th century. Somewhat like they continued to be in World War I. I think that was the last time that people got very rip-roaring excited.
Yeah. It's kind of a romantic notion of
romantic notion. We'll all be home
chivalry
for Christmas.
Yeah.
There is a resolution, I should point out, and I don't want to say that slavery. I want to keep stressing it was the underlying difference between two sections. It's in everybody's mind, and Southerners in their diaries are writing, I wonder if slavery is going to last this war, but nobody knows the mechanism. The North continues to say once the war is started that slavery is not the root. In fact, one senator and one congressman, both from loyal slave states, proposed a resolution in the Congress. This is in July 1861, several months into the war, saying this war is not being fought to to upend any Southern institution. That's the way they put it. Upend slavery. It overwhelmingly passes. And by the way, the Congress is at that point overwhelmingly Republican, because most of the Democrats are Southerners and they're seceded. So the Congress is on record as saying, we are not fighting this war to upend or to do anything about slavery. So, in fact, this is so emphatic that Horace Greeley, the famous journalist, gets so fed up. He says to Lincoln, he writes a column, a famous column, since the prayer of 20 million. 20 million is basically essentially the population of the northern states, loyal states. The prayer of 20 million that you will free the slaves. And I don't really think he was right. There was no majority of Northerners who felt that way. And Lincoln answers him back in very measured terms. He said, and there's no clear definition from Lincoln of his purposes in this. He said, if I could win this war, if I could preserve the Union by freeing no slaves, I would do it. And if I could preserve the Union by freeing every slave, I would do it. And if I could preserve the Union by freeing some slaves and not others, I would do it. And that
Oh,
is
wow.
basically the landscape, before the Emancipation Proclamation, which is now just several months away. And I just want you to consider one thought experiment until we get there, which is late in the war, when the South is desperate for men, they begin to consider emancipating the slaves. I just want you to consider this. So suppose they've been
Wow.
but let me just pose this thought experiment. Suppose they had been very forward thinking, and several months into the war, they say, slaves are beginning to self-emancipate, to escape. This is becoming a real problem. We're bleeding men on the farms. We don't have enough troops. What if we emancipated the slaves? Then, we'd have all these men to fight for us. They'd be loyal. They'd be grateful. What if they had freed the slaves? And Jefferson Davis had sent a telegram to Lincoln saying, the slaves are free now. If you're just fighting for slavery, you can put down your arms and we'll be two separate nations, but you don't have to fight. Well, no way. Lincoln's not going to stop fighting.
Yeah, based on what you just shared with us, he would continue to fight. It's the Union.
He's fighting to preserve the Union.
Yeah.
Now, things are going to evolve, and you'll ask me about that. Things are going to evolve.
Yeah.
In terms of what got us to this point, slavery is there absolutely underlying it. But it's not why the North goes to war.
Interesting. We'll be back after a short break to talk about much of what we've been talking about so far. Evolution of Lincoln's stance on slavery. We'll be right back. What do Russia's oligarchs now have in common with the South's elite, the wealthy owners of huge plantations who enslaved blacks? What does Russia's oil now have in common with the South's cotton before and during the Civil War?
The North was in a very similar situation. The North needed Southern cotton, and they also wanted the British and French to get Southern cotton because they were afraid that the British would intervene in the war on the side of the South or intervene to force a ceasefire and keep the two halves of America independent.
In Season 2, Episode 14, I spoke with Mr. Lowenstein about the history of the Civil War as it relates to the war in Ukraine. We also talked about the economies of the South and the North. I've dropped a link for you to my prior conversation with Mr. Lowenstein. Now, let's get back to our current conversation with Mr. Lowenstein about the causes of the Civil War. Mr. Lowenstein, we talked about Lincoln's view on slavery. What I'm wondering is, what was his personal and political journey to go to the Emancipation Proclamation?
Lincoln is always personally offended by slavery, morally offended. He said things throughout his career. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I mean, just things that you can't make up, that a lawyer didn't write for him. No consultant wrote it for him. Many of your listeners and viewers, I bet, have heard his quotation when he's taking a riverboat ride down the Mississippi River as a young man, and he sees a bunch of enslaved blacks, as he puts it, bound together like fish on a trot line. And he writes back. He's going with his dear friend Jonathan Speed. He writes to Speed's sister of the journey, and he says, "This just torments me." He writes that sometime after the sight of these human beings being treated this way, and he makes statements throughout his political emergence in the 1850s that slavery is wrong, is morally wrong. We all know it's wrong. What he doesn't do is call for abolition because, as referred to at the top of the show, he doesn't believe he has the legal right. A word on Lincoln and the law. He grows up in this era of lynchings, of mob violence. And to Lincoln, no societies are that far from the mob. And there's only one thing that protects us from mob rule. It's the law. And he says, even if a law is unwise, better that we adhere to it religiously and work to change it. Otherwise, how much better are we than any dictatorship or savages, or as they would refer to them then, or whatever. So you have to be law abiding. So he's not an abolitionist. And because of the overriding race prejudice in the areas of the country he grows up, he refuses to advocate for what we would now call civil rights, for social equality, and at the beginning of his career, even for voting for blacks. Although he'll migrate quite a lot, and you'll in terms of his personal feelings, what type of man he was. Frederick Douglass once said, before the Emancipation Proclamation, a blind man could see where his heart is. And when he goes to meet Lincoln in the White House, Lincoln's the first president who ever takes in African-American visitors to the Oval Office. Douglass said he was the first great man who did not remind me of the difference of color. And Sojourner Truth, the woman activist for abolition, escaped slave herself in childhood, she talks about the great cordiality and kindness shown to her. This phrase is important, by that great and good man. So great because he's doing great things, but also good. I think it's a very well chosen phrase.
Because you could be a great man, do great things for your country, but also be cruel, right?
Right, or not have received blacks in the White House.
Yeah.
Treated them with contempt. He
Yeah.
was great, and he was also good. And we can ask ourselves which is more important. But he had both. As the war goes on, he increasingly looks for something that can mobilize the North. The North is not doing very well. It's losing more than its share of battles. He's changing generals. He's if you read his correspondence, he just can't find a general, even to fight the war. McClellan, the boy wonder, doesn't want to get his troops dirty. And
the general that wouldn't fight.
Lincoln at one point is so despairing. He says, "If you won't use your army, I'd like to borrow it. And I'll fight with it." He's a sense of humor, but it's despairing. And he increasingly begins to attack slavery around the edges. In April of 1862, the Congress passes with Lincoln's signature abolition in the emancipation, I should say, in the District of Columbia, federal territory. So that doesn't violate any constitutional provision. It's with compensation, so it's very mild in the sense they don't want to cheat slaveholders. They pass 2 confiscation acts in Congress, which Lincoln signs, which give the North the right to sue for property of Confederate leaders, including property and slaves. That's very hard to effect these. They don't actually lead to any actual blacks being emancipated. And blacks begin to flee in larger numbers to Union lines. Lincoln's still very careful. Twice during this period, generals announce wholesale emancipations in their territory. Lincoln retracts it. That's my bailiwick. Only I have the right. But he's very careful when he does this to say to General Fremont, the second one of them. He doesn't say that he's opposed to emancipation. He just says, "I will pick the time and I will pick the place." So you see, he's evolving. He needs something that will energize the Northern troops. He also realizes, as he's being told, without the slaves, who's going to grow the crops in Southern fields? If the slaves continue to come north, the North will have all these added men to enlist in their army, which they will do, 200,000 nearly, ultimately. So Lincoln begins to think of emancipation as a necessity for the war, as part of his purpose. Remember, his purpose being emancipation. And that's really
his purpose being to preserve the Union.
Preserve the Union.
Yeah.
Means winning the war.
Yeah.
And that's what leads him to the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation, which is issued in 2 steps, one in September 1862, it's just issued as a threat. It says to any states that remain in rebellion, I declare your slaves forever free come January 1. So again, his purpose is to end the rebellion. to bring them back to the Union. If Georgia had said at that point, okay, you win, we're coming back in the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation will not affect slaves in Georgia. And
Wow.
in fact, it does not affect and will not affect slaves in Maryland, because Maryland is not rebelling.
Yeah.
It's a Union state. Does not affect slaves in Kentucky. Does not affect slaves in Delaware, and so on. It only affects slaves in rebellion. It's very carefully tethered to his spoken purpose, and yet the document itself is very dry. It's almost bloodless. All of his great speeches, Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural, first inaugural. There are just so many of them. This is not among them. But having put pen to paper, he realizes, and I think issuing the proclamation itself on January 1 is part of his journey towards realizing that whatever the initial cause, this war is taking on a larger goal now, because he says to a lawyer who's with him at the time, or visits him shortly after, if my name ever goes in the history books, it will be for this one act. My name ever goes into the history books, it will be for this one act. So he begins to think of this as a joint purpose, along with the purpose he never relinquished, which is to stitch the Union back together.
So did the Emancipation Proclamation, as signed on January 1, 1863, did that also affect states that were not, that had not been in the rebellion, or did it?
No, it does not affect. It does not affect states, in slaves in Kentucky and Maryland, Delaware, Missouri. It only affects. It's issued as an act of war.
Yeah.
So it only affects actually districts in states. It's very specific, which are in rebellion against the United States. So it's specifically an act of war, which he felt was the only constitutional basis that he could issue it for. He didn't have any legal right to tell somebody in Maryland, free your slaves.
So, save the constitutional amendment that comes later and abolishes slavery. For how long before that did states like Maryland continue to have slaves? Since the emancipation. Go ahead, please.
Lincoln now is encouraging. They pass a law that will reward loyal states for freeing their slaves, but they don't force them. And their slaves in Maryland, up to the end of the war, and probably until the last state, the last necessary state, signs on later in 1865 to pass the 13th Amendment, abolishes slavery, forever and everywhere in the reunited United States.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about Ms. Nikki Haley's Civil War comment. We'll be right back.
We hope you are enjoying this podcast, and if you are, then why not treat us to a cup of coffee? That's right, for the price of a cup of coffee, you too can become a monthly supporter of the History Behind News podcast. We rely on your support to continue this program, to continue peeling the history behind our news. Supporting us is easy. Just click the support link in the detailed caption of this episode. And while you're there, check out the information about our guests and other attributions and links. And thank you.
Mr. Lowenstein, during the break, you and I were talking about President Lincoln's second inaugural address and sort of his own evolution. I'd love for you to share that with our audience, please.
So one thing that happens to Lincoln during the war is he's in increasing pain over the numbers of lives lost. This is just an horrific bloodletting. He feels personally he's mortified by it. He says at one point in a speech in Philadelphia, he fears that the heavens are wreathed in black.
Wow.
And he begins to look for as human beings do, there must be some purpose. There must be some higher purpose. He's not a a religious man in the sense of any organized. Of course, he's Protestant, but he was not a big churchgoer. Was not affiliated with a particular church.
Mm-hmm.
But he begins to speak of the purposes of the Almighty, as if only Almighty, hopefully Almighty, can explain what we on earth can't explain as some justification for this horrible bloodletting. And he finally finds it in the second inaugural address. The second inaugural is on March 4th, 1865. The war is going to end just about exactly 1 month later. And of course, Lincoln's life is going to end just 4 days after that. So he knows he's towards the end of the war. The slaughter on both sides has been horrific. He doesn't know that he's almost at the end of his life. And he says all knew that this, he talks about the slavery interest. This was somehow the cause of the war. So somehow, not that it was the one cause, the only cause, the thing that brought them to war. It was somehow behind it. He's careful to respect the nuances of history. And then he says that he envisions the war as being the punishment that God meted out to North and South for the crime of slavery, for the 250 years of the bondman's toil. He says, and if God wills it, it will go on till every cent that had been earned through the slave trade and the owning of slaves was frittered away. And so he recasts the war as being divine punishment to the North and to the South for the crime of slavery. And if not as not an initial cause, as a holy purpose, he recasts the war as a punishment for slavery.
That's a profound statement.
Evolution.
Yeah. I was going to say that's a profound statement for a man who is not necessarily devoutly religious, right?
Very profound.
Yeah.
But, suffering brings people to deeper and thoughts and thoughts about the afterlife and the divine purpose. And he was suffering.
Yeah, I know. Finding a reason for why all of this happened. Correct me with some numbers here. I don't remember these offhand. We're talking about slaughter here.
Obviously, this is the coloration he puts on it retrospectively.
Yeah, of course.
It's beautiful poetic coloration, but we have to understand it.
He's not saying this in 1862. He's saying this at the tail end of it in 1865. If I remember correctly from my readings, about 675,000 or so Americans died in the Civil War. That's more than World War I and World War II combined.
Yeah,
I think it's about 100,000 or so in World War I and about 450,000 in World War II.
450 sounds right to me.
Yeah.
Without stealing a look at my cell phone, which I will not do, I thought World War I was closer to 200. But
200.
But you're still right. You're still right.
Yeah. Wow, that is amazing.
And the country, of course, was obviously immeasurably bigger during those wars, and we're combining the total, and we still don't get there.
Exactly. So 675,000 was a much bigger proportion of our population in the 1860s. And wow,
don't forget they're dying at the hands of fellow Americans.
Yeah.
Dying at the hands of fellow
Americans. It really was a slaughter. Mr. Lowenstein, let's use contemporary politics to go back to history again. Ms. Nikki Haley recently said that the Civil War was about basically how the government was going to run. Was there anything about how the federal government was run by President Buchanan right before President Lincoln that could instigate a war?
Look, the divide over slavery gave rise to a whole host of divides. The South was agricultural, the North was industrial. Slave labor fitted agriculture much more. It wasn't clear you could really run industrial plants, railroads, and so on, factories with large numbers of slaves. The South was fearful of going into that sort of economy. they were not anxious they were not eager to have a public education. They thought,
Wow.
their a quotation in my book from a Virginian in the 1600s saying, we don't want, I don't want public education here for hundreds of years. We hope they never come here. They thought it would poison minds of young Southerners, and particularly poor whites.
Yeah.
They were desperate to preserve the fiction that slavery was good for everybody, even the slaves themselves, but particularly the poor whites who they knew they would have to call on to defend slavery someday if it ever came to that. So there were all sorts of the Southern society was much less equal in the sense that we use equality or inequality today. They had slave owners and non-slave owners, whereas the North.
What was the percentage? Do we have any numbers?
Yeah. We have 80% of the whites down south did not own slaves.
Huh.
And only
80%.
Yes, and only 5% of Southerners were big slaveholders. So, if you discount the ones who had maybe a slave or two to help with a garden out back or something, didn't have a plantation, 1 out of 20, what we think of with the Gone with the Wind, the Rhett Butler type mansion. So they really needed the support. The aristocracy really needed the support of lowly, lower class whites to support them in any conflict. But to answer your question, there were all sorts of differences in society that the difference over slavery informed. The North tried to pass a bunch of bills for a Homestead Act. For instance, was one of them where the government would give land, if you'd farm it for 5 years. They wanted to fill the territories with this. South didn't want that. They wanted to fill those territories with slaves. So the divide over slavery kept the Congress from passing a Homestead Act. Same thing.
They wanted to expand their cotton plantations, essentially, geographically.
Exactly. Same thing. The North wanted to pass what became the Moral Land Grant Act to form colleges on federal lands. They wanted to pass a Department of Agriculture. Jefferson Davis, to help farmers, the South was mortally afraid of any expanded federal government because, as one Southerner said in the 1830s, he said, a government that builds canals can more easily emancipate. We don't want a strong federal government. Once they start doing things, they're going to go to where we don't want them to go. So there were differences in the conception of government, what government could do, what government should do, but that had nothing to do with what happened the immediate cause in 1861, I think was the one we discussed.
Mr. Lowenstein, you and I talked about a year ago about your book, Ways and Means, and I'll provide a link for our listeners to listen to that episode. I've read your book, and the reason I bring it up is now that you bring up poor white Southerners, it reminds me of your book. Reading your book, it was about economy and how the North and the South tried to finance the war. One of the things that I went away with, I don't think it's a stretch, but you can correct me. The war didn't seem to be a fight between the North and the South. It was more like the North fighting the elite of the South. That's how it started. And then the poor whites got sucked into this. Because as I read your book, the poor whites were doing really badly in their lives.
They were doing really, really badly. It was really a war, I think, between two different types of civilizations. One of them was more what we would call middle class. They had town squares and village meetings. They had public facilities, libraries, lyceums, and so on.
What's a lyceum? I don't know what
lyceum was a place where speakers would go. Lincoln would speak at the Springfield Lyceum and so on.
Oh, okay.
They had a sense of community, and in the town square, around the town. They shared information about crops with each other, and so on. There was a sense of civic society in these little towns in New England, Pennsylvania, New York, and so on. The South were organized around large plantations, very rich people, and everybody else. And there's the descriptions of these poor Southerners living in these tar shacks, standing at the side of the roadside when a northerner rode home. His descriptions of them right before the war, and he described their hands in their pockets as if they didn't even have the impetus to shield their eyes from the sun. They were that backward. There was no industrial progress. He saw mules trying to pull stuck wagons out of the mud and tar. It was just a backward society. And the South was really afraid of progress because progress could mean ultimately emancipation. The South was petrified. The Southern leaders, secession came wholly from the slave owners. It was their project. They controlled the legislatures. Almost none of the states had referendums. They didn't want it to go to a popular vote. And in the correspondence between the leaders, they said it will never pass. A very interesting comment from a man named Mr. Brown, governor of Georgia, right around the time of secession. And he said, the poor man's best government is slavery. The poor man's best government is slavery. So not roads, not railroads, not an act to bring colleges to the people, not a Homestead Act so they can have land to farm, education, all the things that Lincoln wanted to bring. What he meant was, if we have slavery, you, the poor whites, are at least one rung up above the bottom. That's what we're offering you. The poor man's best government is slavery. And a North Carolinian who was a lower middle class but educated North Carolinian, Hinton Rowan Helper, wrote a book a few years before the Civil War, called The Impending Crisis of the South. And what he did was he compared the average incomes in North Carolina and New York, in Georgia and Massachusetts. He compared all states, state by state, education, industry, income, and so on. And he said, you guys are screwed. You the poor whites, you're getting a bad deal here. This is a government, an aristocratic government. It's not working for you. It's working for themselves. This slave society, not only doesn't it work for the blacks, but his audience didn't much care about that. It doesn't work for the 80% of whites who didn't own slaves. The book was banned across the South.
I bet
it caused a tremendous uproar. And in fact, there was a huge fight because when John Sherman of Ohio was nominated to be Speaker of the House before the war, and Southerners were still in the House.
Is this General Sherman's brother?
This is General Sherman's brother.
Yeah.
But John Sherman had been in a list of representatives who would endorse the book. I'm sure he never read it. He was not particularly liberal on race relations, but there was a fight for nearly 6 months, and then finally they just couldn't get his nomination to, because anyone who would endorse this book, whether he read it or not, was persona non grata Southerners. But this book got really at their weak spot. Much more than critiques. There were plenty of critiques, and I go through some of them from Northerners of the Southern society. But to have one of their own, saying, "You're betraying us. You're betraying us," this really got it at their weak spot.
So, had they held some sort of referendum, do you think poor Southerners would have voted against going to war?
I do.
Because of race,
I don't know what kind of propaganda.
Race complicates this.
What kind of propaganda they would have been subject to.
Yeah.
How free the balloting would have been.
Yeah.
And so on. We saw that happen in elections in the South in the latter period regarding African Americans, but they had no economic interest in it. Now, would they have been deluded? Once the shooting started, it was different, because then the aristocrats were able to convince Johnny Reb, well, you're fighting, for the honor of the South, for your own territory, people, and so on.
Yeah.
That changed that game. But would they have realized it is a hard question. But they really had no economic interest. In fact, in areas that were not deep South states, for instance, in North Carolina, there was a tremendous amount of resistance to the wars that went on. And there were areas of North Carolina backwoods that were basically in virtual rebellion. To the rebellion that the Confederate Army didn't dare go into. I mean, they were in tacit rebellion, and there were letters back and forth between the governor and various people say you have to get your people in line. What you're doing is you're an insurrection against the insurrection.
Wow.
Because they felt they were being starved and for what end, they began to say, so they began to have trouble, particularly backwoods areas, mountain areas. Not the low-lying deltas where there were huge cotton crops, where slavery was so much a part of the economy.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Mr. Lowenstein as we get into the perspective.
The History Behind News podcast is available on all your favorite podcast platforms. Of course, we love your reviews and ratings of our podcast, especially on Apple and Spotify. And remember, don't keep us to yourself. Tell a friend about the History Behind News podcast.
Mr. Lowenstein, let's return to Ms. Haley's statement, which she essentially retracted later. I think she said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, slavery caused the Civil War. That's my interest is not to talk about that. In your January 2nd newsletter on Substack, which I subscribe to and love, you had this this line, quote, "If the causes of great events could be fitted into single sentences, we would not need history books," unquote. So, yeah, how do we communicate the complexities of histories nowadays?
Very self-serving since I read history books. But I think Republicans, but also some Democrats, particularly in the far left, have gotten themselves in sort of an unnecessary bind or war of sound bites. So what Nikki Haley is, there's sort of two extreme views. And one of them, I think, was represented in the New York Times' 1619 Project, where they basically said anything that happened in American history was due to slavery. I mean, that's a paraphrase, but it's a pretty faithful paraphrase.
Mm-hmm.
And that's obviously not true. I mean, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. It doesn't have anything to do with slavery. I mean, I don't want to make the whole show about that. And there were many other divisions that divided North and South, as we talked about, the sort of all these other economic divisions. And there was this whole issue of preserving the Union, which was the immediate reason why Lincoln and the North went to war. But that doesn't mean, so I think, the people on the far left, there's no need to overstate the case. Slavery was the huge issue between these sectors, and nobody is or nobody should be disputing that. And on the other hand, I think Nikki Haley, presumably because she's in a political primary and didn't want to offend maybe who she perceives as to be Republican voters, refused to say the S word. And she said, what causes slavery?
I love
which is ridiculous.
S word.
Which is ridiculous. And, I hope we haven't gotten to the point where we can't discuss history in political campaigns, but if politicians want to wade in, then there's no need to have to do it in a soundbite. And hopefully whoever they're talking to will quote them or air them at some length. History can be complicated, and we learn from its complexity. It's rich, and we shouldn't shy away. I remember I said the Civil War was really two steps. The South seceded, and that was because of the fear that the Republicans would be too harsh on slavery, and the North went to war to preserve the Union.
Yeah,
those are different, and if you try to oversimplify things, then you sacrifice a good deal of accuracy and understanding. And
let me ask you a bigger question about our country. I often hear this from other scholars. They talk about even countries that are oppressed, such as the Middle East. They talk about how society, not just the scholarly elite, society engages in intellectual conversations about philosophy, history, and what. They even have classes that are oversubscribed. Do you think that in America we've lost the taste for that. Maybe that was back in the 1960s, that we just don't really do that anymore.
I think there are still, you mean intellectual discussions and so on? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah.
I think we still have tremendous scholars in this country. There are lots of people enrolled at universities. Some of them take their studies very seriously. Some of them continue to be very interested. I think we've lost a little bit of the ability to disagree with each other with some sort of suppleness or flexibility, recognition that history is complicated. There isn't necessarily, one view. I mean, there's some expressions came up during COVID. It's come up during climate change. The science. You can talk about the science, and actually, science is not a the. It's an evolving process. If you talk to a scientist about how they think about things, there's a hypothesis. They go with it. After a while, someone has another hypothesis, and it keeps adjusting. I mean, after all, Einstein proved Newton wrong, and Einstein, part of Einstein's theory now, quantum theory has replaced part of Einstein.
Yeah,
I don't want to lose all of our readers with quantum physics.
Yeah,
and lose myself too. But when we tend to think of, we think back to the pandemic, the CD was continuously saying, we think this, and then some weeks later, some months later, findings changed. We knew more. We were 2 months into the pandemic, then 6.
But that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing. But when you say the science, as if it's the Talmud or the Bible, there's only one Bible. There's only one Old Testament. There's only one New Testament. It'll never change. It's immutable, and that's immutable. You can't argue with that.
Their interpretation could change.
Yes, science is not immutable, and if you think about it as immutable, then people become more rigid and inflexible. And I think I just use the example of science.
Yeah.
I think that's entered into too many discussions. And that's why, Thanksgiving used to be an easy time for families. And now it's like, well, Uncle Joe's coming and Aunt Sarah, they don't get along. We better,
politically. Yeah. That's interesting. Mr. Lowenstein, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thanks very much.
Adel, always my pleasure.
The opinions and statements of our guests are their own. We neither agree nor disagree with them. We're only interested in the perspective they provide through history. At History Behind News, we're honored that our guests share their expertise with us, most of which are based on years of scholarship and research, and we provide links to their projects and publications for your benefit to review them if you wish. Otherwise, we're not affiliated with our guests. We just think they teach us pretty cool history, the history behind our news. Also, unless we explicitly inform you, we're not affiliated with any institutions, including Amazon, for which book links are shared here from time to time for your convenience. Finally, as a reminder, we don't do news here at History Behind News. We peel the news for the history behind it. And our mission is not to provide a complete account and analysis of the past, rather is to highlight some issues and incidents in our history that may poke and prod your discerning minds into seeking some perspective for our news. And if you disagree with our take on history, well then, it means we've succeeded in getting you to think about the history behind news. And of course, share your thoughts with me by leaving your comments on Twitter or sending an email to adel@historybehindnews.com. I love to hear from you. I love to learn from you. Until next time, this is Adel with History Behind News, a history podcast for our news.